So, good morning everyone. Welcome to Massey University's Retail Reboot webinar. This is number 5 in our series that is aiming to help small retailers and small businesses adjust to and thrive in the new retail environment. It's not just small retailers that are of interest, and for today's topic in particular, I think this may be of interest to retailers across the country. We have 2 excellent guest speakers, which I will introduce in a minute. But our topic today is looking at stocks, costs, and streams, right-sizing financial flows in the new environment. So I'm Andrew Murphy. I'm a senior lecturer in retail marketing at Massey University. And it's my pleasure to organize and host these webinars. Last week, you may have seen my colleague Sarah Dodds, who did an awesome job, and Sarah will come back in a few weeks' time and host another, because I think she enjoyed it so much. Isn't that right, Sarah? Yes, it is. So in previous weeks, we've looked at how to get online. That was webinar 1. Webinar 2 was looking at lease and legal considerations, which were very pressing when we were still in lockdown, and I think it's still the case for a number of retailers. Webinar 3 was looking at digital marketing and ways that you can connect with customers. And last week with Retail X, we looked at store environments and how retailers have responded to getting back into business. So today we have Jean Durand from IE Retail. Jean has many years of experience in a range of countries, New Zealand and Australia, South Africa, and the United States in particular. And his company operates both in New Zealand and in those countries and others. And we also have Sam Shrestanya, now at Paper Plus Group. Sam is originally from the UK and has a lot of experience with Sainsbury's. He's been in New Zealand for 14 years. Or thereabouts, and has worked with a range of New Zealand retailers, including at the Warehouse Group and with Whitcoulls and Paper Plus for the last few years. So welcome, both of you. For those of you watching this, if you have any questions that come to you when either Jean or Sam are speaking, please put those questions into the chat box so they can see those questions as they come up. They can respond to them at the time, or we will allow time at the end for those text questions. And if you wish to ask your question directly to the speakers verbally, we'll make time for that at the end as well. So first up, Jean.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Welcome everyone. I see a couple of familiar faces, so it's nice to have you along. Thank you very much. I'll try and be nice and brief. We've got about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll hand over to Sam. But just to give you a bit of an idea, Andrew's done a good job of introducing who we are. I work with a number of, or we work rather, with a number of businesses that I can see on the screen in front of us, and a number of others in Australia and in the US and South Africa. It's interesting, I was saying to Andrew just before we kick off that, in fact, this topic has been a topic that I've now spoken to a number of different businesses about, large and small, and it's been quite interesting. I've started moving around the country quite a bit already in the last week and a half since we got to level 2, and it's been really, really interesting to see how different businesses have been responding to what's going on. So my part, Sam and I are splitting this pretty much down the middle. I've got the top half of the P&L, he's got the bottom half of the P&L. I'm going to be looking at additional revenue streams and opportunities, identifying what those might look like. I completely understand some of them, depending on how big the business is, the capital availability and the resource availability to invest in those streams will be within reach of some and not within reach of others, and I appreciate that. And Sam's going to look at the bottom half around OPEX and managing of costs and all the rest of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you now, and just take you through a couple of those, a couple of slides. And as Andrew said, if you have any questions, please just pose them and we'll get to them towards the end. So I've broken it up into 2 pieces. The first piece I'm going to talk to you about is before we look at different revenue streams and what those revenue streams options look like, I just wanted to go back one step. And it's certainly something that we advise a lot of our clients to do anyways. Think about identifying revenue streams on the back of really great identification and understanding of the impacts of the last 6 to 8 weeks, the good, the bad, and the submerged. I'm going to try hard not to recover old ground in some of the previous webinars that you've done. Mainly, I know a lot of them are around digital and the online space and the rest of it. So, but I do want to highlight 3 or 4 things that have been pretty interesting to look at before we look at these revenue streams. The first, I'll use New Zealand Pharmacy as an example, but this was a really interesting report that came from Kantar Retail just a couple of weeks ago. And I've seen that, I'm sure you have as well, played out in many different ways in New Zealand already anyway, and it's pressure on the normal distribution curve. So essentially, if the normal distribution curve for price points, and we're looking at the most popular price sitting somewhere around here, then the normal distribution curve has come under an enormous amount of pressure at the luxury end of this range. A really good case in point is pharmacy as an example. Pharmacy, depending on where you are in the country, but pharmacy, obviously a large portion of the margin comes out of cosmetics, cosmeceuticals, eau de parfum, that kind of part of the business. And on a relative basis, relative to their industry, of course, the margin attractiveness down other categories, whether that's cold and flu, supplements, etc., those kinds of things, general merchandise, those margins aren't necessarily as attractive. And so what a lot of pharmacies have seen, from all the way from Kaitaia down to Invercargill, is huge pressure on this part of the range. That's been played out in many ways in other industries as well. The interesting thing about this price pressure here is because so much of the sale and the volume has moved down to the bottom end of the range, a couple of interesting things come up. The first thing is options for private label. So different countries have had very different experiences. In certain instances, private label has actually not worked particularly well at all through COVID and even post-COVID. And I expect that given where we're going to go over the next couple of months, that depending on the industry we're in, there's probably quite a lot to be gained in understanding what that might mean in terms of options for our own retailers. And the second one, and a lot of businesses, supermarkets probably more than anyone else, will understand the massive impact that supply chain bullwhips have had over the last couple of months. And many of those supply chain and logistics issues are set to be there for a decent chunk of time going forward still. From personal experience, just trying to find flour has been a massive issue for a while, and it's not because there's no flour. In many respects, it's because there's no packaging. So those kinds of impacts and this normal price distribution, I think, is something worth considering for many businesses going forward. Sam will talk to you about pricing and promotion when we get into the second half of this. The next one for me has been just what Google Analytics can tell us about what's happened. I'm not going to go to Donald Trump's search for bleachers, and I'm not going to look at restaurants being replaced by delivery, but I am going to look at this very interesting one for me, which was this monster spike in how-to searches online. And how-to, not only about how to do a food garden, how to bake a banana loaf, how to this, how to that. It's just, it's been interesting to see how many customers, this is my interpretation anyway, how many customers we didn't know would use our stores as educational and navigational opportunities for their decision trees and how they go about making decisions. And in the absence of being able to go to a bricks and mortar business, I mean, it's quite obvious in hindsight, the how-to searches have just absolutely spiked. I think that's another opportunity that we can explore, but later on down the track, because that how-to search online in some way, shape, or form is something which, and I think we all know this, our customers search for in store all the time, but depending on how and where we satisfy that need, we may or may not have an opportunity for looking at that. The third piece I wanted to have a look at was a really interesting piece of work done by the China World Panel, a bloke called Jason Yu, and he broke up ranging and assortment into a slightly different way of looking at it. Now, their example and ours locally are quite interesting, but I'm going to just bring your attention to these 4 colored bars for a second. Depending on the industry and the categories that you're in, there have been a number of retailers who've seen growth in certain categories and or parts of their category, either during and or post-COVID. Forget about the numbers down the bottom. I'm just using this as an example. It's just as a sample number. And it's not just whether you're allowed to be open or not. It also has to do with how easy it was to get to utilize all the online options or delivery options that you may have had. The second one was limited impact, so limited change. Sales continued more or less the same. Again, it depends on the kind of category that you're in. There's a whole lot of categories that went into V-shape, quite obviously, but I expect, and he expects, they'll come back pretty, very, very quickly in the same V-shape as when they fell off a cliff during level 4 in our experience. But then there are a whole lot of categories we can classify as high risk, where the decline was ridiculously rapid, fell off a cliff, but the claw back is going to take a long time, if at all, in many respects. To give you an example of some of those, and I'm making these examples up, but anything to do, a lot of retailers have certainly been, certainly that I've spoken to, and our people have spoken to across the country, anything to do with a lot of self-reliance, massive spikes. I'm not going to include things like toilet paper as an example, because these pantry stockers, it's false growth. They will pay the price for those a bit later on, obviously, I saw the bloke in Brisbane trying to hand back, I think, 150 pallets of toilet paper back to one of the Metcash stores. Limited impact, some consumables, things which are necessary and will just continue to be necessary. Big declines in businesses like Garden Green, and for very obvious but sometimes quite surprising reasons, will come back really, really strongly, as an example. But this area here around luxury, a real worry, especially if you take the pharmacy example I used a bit earlier. Some very, at one stage, not that long ago, 10, 12 days ago, my understanding, pretty reliably, was that the average pharmacy across New Zealand down around 50%. So, I mean, those numbers are pretty staggering when you consider that kind of thing. Some other things which I thought were quite interesting coming out of this, just looking at some new and newish trends or insights. And I'm going to classify these, those opportunities relate to category. Baking is new habits, personal care, household care, gardening. These are interesting habits that a lot of customers have picked up during the lockdown period. Second bunch of categories around customer. And in fact, this week, I've seen more advertising and promotion and media on Shop Local than I probably have seen for many, many months, if not years. And clearly that strategy is something which is going to be pushed very, very hard for very, very good reason. And it would be a real pity for an individual retailer not to take advantage of whatever doors get opened as a result of shopping local. And the last one, of course, is, I'm just going to put this as other, I know you've, for many of you who've been in on many of the other webinars that Andrew has set up, they would have covered a lot of the online stuff. So I'm just going to take that one step further and go, the real opportunity, if you are one of the fortunate few where your online has not fallen off a cliff since we got back to level 2 again, linking online to offline is probably way more important than we may have expected, if we'd expected online to continue in the way in which we assumed would have been just 4 or 5 weeks ago. And to put some numbers against that for a second, there are a number of businesses where online has quadrupled, or in fact, in certain instances, general merchandise, hardware stores, gifting, businesses like that, where because they closed the business, their online went up to 80%, 85%, but that's, similarly speaking, as literally just fallen off a cliff as well. The minute we could go back to stores, customers went back to stores. So online to offline, last mile commerce is an enormous opportunity for many of these businesses, as is subscription. Sam will pick up with the subscription discussion with you just a wee while. Just on this particular topic, there's a lot of very interesting reading around these blue ones in particular. And I won't, as I said, I won't really go into that detail just now, because if you're interested, you can ask some of those questions and explain a bit more of that, towards the end of this webinar. But I think it was interesting to see how many retailers discovered that two things. Firstly, that their readiness for online was probably not as good as they would have liked it to be. But secondly, the last mile commerce, that last 100 meters in the kilometer dash to get stuff to customers. And what I mean by the last mile is whether that's a pickup option outside a store, or a delivery option, or a pickup somewhere else, or a curbside, or whatever it might be. That last mile, in many, many respects, has actually negated or enhanced their entire online opportunities. I'm going to give you an example in just a minute. So those are the four areas that that I just wanted to ID before we look at the individual options. The case, of course, is what to do, what to do, what to do. And a couple of things I want to highlight here, which a lot of smart retailers, certainly, and again, I'm talking really recent, just in the last couple of weeks, seem to be doing really well. And this is working with individual stores and even and a lot of big business at the moment. The first thing is there's a lot more focus on getting stuff for your customers and not customers for your stuff. And that is, it impacts on range, it impacts on all sorts of different elements of range management. But there will need to be a big focus on exactly that particular point. The second one is this relentless and continuing pursuit for friction-free. So what I mean by that is online isn't convenient because it's online. Online is convenient because it's friction-free. Farm Source, PGG Wright's and the rural supplies businesses are a really good example of that. Their stores were open during level 4 and level 3 because they were deemed an essential service. But they, in many instances, didn't let customers, farmers, into the store at all. Yet they actually managed, in many instances, managed to grow their sales year on year, like on like, without actually having anybody in the store. So convenience doesn't always equal online because it's convenience is about friction-free, and so a real opportunity, I think, around that is what happens with friction-free purchasing, no matter whether that's a bricks and mortar or an online or some other BOPIS channel. And the last one is, and I think we've seen this, and as we said, these things are I've heard this a number of times. Things change very fast, but certainly progress is better than perfection, especially when you consider things like the telephone are actually still a really good way to get hold of your customers sometimes if it is a small audience and you have a sales force that actually deals with them directly. So that's something that a lot of them have done. That brings me to the last part of this discussion, really, and that is that what could you do? And I've got some examples I'll talk through as we get here. The first one is I've tried to keep these for SMEs, and in the sense that there are when Andrew explained the purpose behind the webinars, a lot of this was about talking to SMEs, even though I appreciate there are a lot of bigger businesses online as well and listening now as well. But a number of supermarkets have done some really clever things to create stickability around online as an additional option. I'll give you an example of one that I think is just clever, but nice and simple. And that is that if there are, if you're selling trays of mints online or rolls online, then putting baker's dozens in rolls online with stickers saying online, we thank you for shopping online, but with us, we sell baker's dozens online versus the 12 you pick up in store at the same price, are tiny little ways for businesses to keep some stickability around what happens with an online customer. As many retailers have told me in the last week and a half, they have seen a monster shift back to people coming into their stores for very obvious reasons, but it would be great to retain some of that online business anyway. The second one is cleaning up the last mile. A really good example for me here is the pet vet channel. So DTS, direct to store inventory, when the vets and the pet shops were closed down in many instances, certainly the pet stores were closed down in many instances, one or two suppliers went straight to the channel and said, well, we would like to support what you're doing. Why don't we explore mutually beneficial options to get direct to store? You take the order, whether that through whatever format you can, and we'll do the delivery for you, which for obvious reasons is a much more efficient way to get product direct to store. So in channels where that actually hadn't happened before, not direct to store, direct to site, in channels where that hadn't happened before. So certainly for pet stores, that was a really interesting option for them to pursue. And having spoken to a number of them now in the last week, it's almost a bit of a no-brainer as to why that hasn't happened before. The third one is a bit more difficult to do if you consider who I'm using as an example, but actually not that difficult to do when you consider what it is all about, which is Amazon have this concept of a flywheel, which is they probably do better than anybody else. And the flywheel their concept of the flywheel simply says, I will hook the customer in with a loyalty program called Prime, and I'll charge you, depending on where you are in the world, call it $100 a year for the Prime membership. But what it will give you, I will continually add value so that the stickability of my loyalty scheme just gets better and better all the time. So everything from whether that's Amazon Web Services and hosting, to music, to movies, to free delivery, to to exclusive arrangements online, exclusive promotional opportunities. All of these kinds of things are options that I would think a retailer would be asking themselves right now, which is, how do I, instead of just having the existing loyalty loyalty scheme or card that we've used in the past, is there any way for me to continually add options to that card to make the stickability for my business better than all? I think Air New Zealand, continually do really good things in this particular space. I know it doesn't work for everybody, but certainly just trying to create value on an ongoing basis. Amazon's flywheel is a good example of that. Number 4 is, if I'm an SME, I might not have the balance sheet or the resource or the capital to invest in great big additional, great big hairy tech to get my customer, to get that database and the channel for delivery. But there is a lot of tech that actually still works pretty well. And the rural supply stores I mentioned earlier was a really good example in New Zealand, where they closed the store, they activated their field forces, what they call a technical field force, who would normally be calling on customers anyway, but they activated them to go straight to site and insist the farming community get what they would not normally be able to get without popping into the store, just changing that channel. And in fact, what they found is things like the telephone actually worked really well. And as I said, the numbers that they managed to put together were very surprising. I spoke to a few people in the channel who were absolutely gobsmacked at how well some simple technology actually worked, which goes to show, again, it's not about online as much as it is about convenience. Multi-purposing the store is another option. Countdown, we've seen them, and the whole dark store discussion in the last few weeks anyway, but actually a really good example of that. Follow Walmart's progress from 2014 to 2020. In 2014, they started talking about the store as the temple, and all they meant was, well, why not just repurpose our store, not just as what it is, which is a place where people come to buy stuff, but also as a storage site and a distribution depot. Walmart have added $100 billion worth of value in 6 years since they took that particular route. So that's been an incredible success for them. Subscription services, many businesses. I've put a couple of names in there, whether that's Warby Parker, the optometrist, Mekonomen, Scandinavian auto parts businesses, and I've used the pet vet example anywhere, but anywhere where there is predictive forecasting of product, makes for some really good subscription services. Using local delivery, it's their business model, not ours. One of the best examples I can think of is somebody like IKEA, who have a company called TaskRabbit. For the retailer to try and own the entire value chain may or may not be a good strategic move, but if there are excellent partners who are good at that, that might be a much better option to do. And Uber Eats is a classic example of that. And the last one I've put in here is the combination of services and products. So in hardware, they speak about DIFM, DIWM, do it for me, do it with me. And that's the ability that says, if I'm buying furniture, if I'm buying office or whatever it might be, it would be great if the service that goes with it when it's being set up is actually available from you as well. I think that kind of example is going to be an enormous opportunity for retailers who are still fixated around services, because we're seeing that mix between service and product change very, very dramatically and very fast, I think. And if you combine that with some of the comments I made earlier about the how-to search, for example, it seems to me to be a little bit of a no-brainer in some respects to add that. Our local retailers in New Zealand, some are better at doing that than others. But yes, it's the last one I've put in there. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think my time is just about up anyway, Andrew. 25 minutes or so anyway. If there are any questions, we can take them at the end, if that's okay. And I'll hand back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jean. So just pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned there. The last mile problem that you talked about, and the linking of the online and offline. That's going to be part of the topic for next week in webinar 6, which is closely related to this one, but it's looking at the physical flows of stocks into, around and out from a business. And we will in particular explore that issue of the last mile. So stay tuned for that one, but excellent foreshadowing there. Thank you, Jean. The subscription one, Sam, I believe you'll pick that one up, but I'll come back to it if that question is still hanging there, which will be awesome. The question about services, I know a number of retailers were looking at getting into rental of equipment. So some, Mitre 10, Bunnings, and so on, have a vast stock of products that customers may not use very often, but really need them when they need them for a short period of time. Rental of equipment in a COVID environment has some issues, of course, with handling of product, with items that may not be easily sterilized and cleaned. So I'm wondering if you have any perspective, or if you've been hearing anything from the retailers that you talk to about their thinking about that.
You're asking me, Andrew?
I am, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that there's this sensitivity around hiring and sharing of equipment. There's no doubt about that. But I'm absolutely convinced that we've heard the term used to death, this new normal, the new normal. I'm pretty convinced that the new normal in some respects will not be very different from the old normal. And so the predictions that things like online will stabilize at these big numbers is not proving to come true. But also I think that things like, I mean, there's an app that I'm very aware of called Neighborly, where households are sharing product already anyway. I have no doubt that there might be a dip and a wariness about how that kind of thing will work going forward, but I have no doubt there'll be a massive part of retail anyway. To give you just to put some numbers behind that for a second again, if you can prove to your customers that you take that kind of worry and care seriously, then they will, in many respects, trust you. Best example I can give you right now is Amazon were due to deliver a $4 billion profit just a couple of weeks ago, which they've stuck straight back into their supply chain and said I used the term in one of the earlier slides, they are effectively vaccinating their supply chain from source of supply all the way through to customer. That vaccination of the supply chain is designed quite simply to tap into something which we know is a trend in local retail anyway, which is about ethics and traceability and heritage and the security that comes from knowing where I buy my stuff from, and that there is an integrity about what I'm going to get and where it's going to come from. So that's been a trend for years already, but they've just injected an enormous amount of money into that. I can see no reason why in a much smaller way, a lot of local retailers, they might not have the same resource, obviously, to put that kind of money behind, but it's the same, the principle is exactly the same. So yeah, it might drop off for a while, but I can't see it being anything but a big part of what happens of the future anyway.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Jean. Right, so that was largely above the line, and now we turn to Sam to hear about what retailers can do about the below the line, how to look at costs. Sam.
So look, I'm going to talk about the bottom half of the P&L. I'm calling this show me the money. Look, sometimes people get described as experts, right? I would say take this as one man's view. That's what it is. Years ago, someone said an expert is two things. X is an unknown quantity, and spurt is a drip under pressure, and that might be me at the moment. Look, one other point to just note as well is this. I would say through this period, post-COVID, just trust your judgment. Jean said something about some of the expectations with regard to online versus offline. There's been all sorts of predictions about what would happen. We've been really surprised in our business about how well we've traded for as long as we've traded in alert level 2. And all I'm saying is, no one knows. People will have opinions. Trust your judgment is my perspective on all of this. So if you're looking at managing your costs, the one thing I'd say is this. I keep hearing people saying it's desperate, it's tough, we're looking at everything. You actually haven't got the time to. So principally, I say follow some principles, and that is go where the money is. So if you're a retailer, typically your costs will be in stock, your cost of goods sold, your labor, and your property costs. Now, I know there's been other seminars on property costs, and it was actually Katrina Hammond, who's a friend of mine, who ran one of those sessions. And it's an ongoing focus for a lot of retailers. But the simple reality is, if you're going to spend your energy, go where the cash is. Now, the other point I'd make here as well, though, is in this post-COVID environment, it is incredibly tough. And what we have to stay on top of as retailers is our cash. So whilst we're looking at costs and the way they manifest themselves in the P&L, the simple reality is ultimately what you're trying to do is reduce your exposure in terms of cash. So that could be as far as deferring, delaying payments to suppliers. It also could be just looking at the costs you're incurring in your P&L. But I guess the other point to make here as well is, while you're doing this stuff, it's good to be clear about what your non-negotiables are. So maybe you start off by saying, we won't do anything that materially impacts service. Or there might be a piece around the quality of the product that you deliver, especially for some iconic items. But the reality is, once you're clear about those things, absolutely everything else is fair game, within the confines of focusing where the money is. Now, the other point I'd make here is this, and Jean's talked about it as well. There's a piece around doing the work and then acting quickly. And I'd just reinforce that message. Look, from my point of view, it's not about having the information. It's not about having the context. I know that I would like to lose weight. I'm not overweight because I don't have the information. I'm overweight because I've got the information and I haven't done enough with it. So rather than being clever about this, we're saying, if you're going to crack on and do this work, do the analysis, get the context, but do something. That's the only way you're going to see results. So there's no real science in this. It's just common sense practicality. The other point I make here as well is this, though. What people often spend time doing is trying to get it absolutely right. And I think in this environment, you're actually better off getting it directionally accurate, doing the best job you can, and I would say be more aggressive than prudent. And the only reason for that is, if you go too far, it's easy to unpick it and to reintroduce costs that you've taken out. If you don't push hard enough, then you might just run out of time with regard to being able to do it at some point in the future. So if you're going to address your costs, address them aggressively. This next slide is called The Price is Right, or Is It? And the reason why I've included it is because so much of the time, what we do as retailers is we look for those other costs, obvious costs that sit in the P&L. And we miss the hidden costs that are things like markdowns, promotions, discounts, just pricing opportunities. And generally speaking, for a lot of retailers, this will be the biggest cost that we lose sight of. Now, we're talking about subscriptions, and I can probably fit it in here. One of the beauties of a subscription model is that if you get the mix right, you're going to be able to essentially get your customers to pay for a lot of the discounts or the promotions that they're going to get in the future. And not only will you be able to do that, you'll be able to tie them into your business at the same time as them paying in advance for the discounts you're going to give them. So there's an element of this thinking in loyalty programs, but this is a slightly different build on that says, let's draw cash in early, and then we can afford to give discounts later on at a later date. So one of the questions you might want to ask yourself is how good you are within your business at tracking what you do give away in terms of promotional giveaway. So Anything that's less than your normal for a retail price, are you actually tracking it? And are you genuinely managing it? Because if you're not, then that will be one of the biggest costs that people talk about in terms of margin bleed, and tend to think about the fix just as a pricing issue, but the impact is absolutely significant hidden cost. Okay, so the fairest of them all, this slide is about looking at your suppliers and thinking carefully about what it is they bring to your organization, and ultimately what it is you're looking for from them going forward. So it would include things like looking at delivery costs and gross margin and the like. But quite often people miss the impact of minimum order quantities or minimum order values that mean that you are overspending with some suppliers, because whilst their product is important, what they're causing you to do is upweight your spend because of some of the metrics they put in place. So ask yourself the question, how your suppliers are driving your performance. And here are some of the metrics you can look at to understand what they are delivering to your business. I guess beyond that as well, if you want to mitigate your stock holding and mitigate your cost in stock, then one of the things it's worth doing is to understand your assortment and really get into the questioning as to how broad you go. Because it could well be, and again, there's no real retail science here, but it could well be that you narrow your assortments, and in narrowing your assortments, you are spending more money with fewer suppliers and using that to leverage better deals as well. So it's worth looking at that as an option. I guess beyond that as well, when we talk incentives, if you are doing more business with a smaller supplier base, then there might be opportunities for mitigating your cost or actually driving cash improvements by just asking. Maybe there's an option for early settlement discount. And in a world where money is cheap, it's worth exploring. Maybe there's things like free stock. But it's just asking those questions of your supplier base and seeing if there's ways that you can reduce your costs as a result. Third point here, though, is one that we often lose sight of, I think, as retailers as well. And that is, look, if your supplier has problems, and typically most suppliers will have remnants of stock that they want to get rid of. There's seasonal items that are changing. Just because they're a pain for someone else, it doesn't mean they're a pain for you as a retailer. So one of the best ways of exploring those things is just a conversation and saying, look, is there any gear that you're trying to get rid of? Because a pain for them could well be pleasure for you in terms of getting product at a great price and also fixing an issue for your supplier at the same time. So if they know you as someone who can help with that sort of a problem, you could see more of those opportunities going forward. So look, quite often when we talk about reducing cost, the last thing we think about is potentially spending in order to be able to do that. And I just want to share one thought with you here about something I've seen work fantastically well. So I started off talking about promos and markdowns, promotional retail giveaway. I've actually come across a solution that someone once implemented that absolutely threw us. We were looking at performance in a different business. And there was one store that consistently had higher stock turn, it had better margins, and was just generating more cash than the rest of the business. But the thing that it also had fantastic results in terms of its aged stock. Looking at the metrics, they weren't selling a different mix of products. They were selling broadly what everyone else was selling. And we couldn't understand why their figures were so much better. So in the end, we went and asked, go and talk to them, what is it you're doing? What they were actually doing was quite fascinating because they had someone who was always looking at stock and always looking at underperforming SKUs, identifying what they wanted to do with them. And when they wanted to sell them, instead of doing deep retail discounts and identify necessarily to your customers that these are problem items. Essentially what they would do is they would get the team together and they'd say, guys, we've got a problem with these. We want to sell a load of these. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend money incentivizing you to sell these. And for each one you sell, we'll either give you a payment, or what they also did, which really worked well, is they would double the payment and say you could use that as credit for getting stock in the store. Now, in this organization, worked really well because a lot of the team members were students. And actually, if you're giving someone an extra $1 for a unit of something that they sell, that's meaningful work for them. That's decent money. But it's also a lot less than you'd have taken off the retail price to get rid of that item. So there are opportunities to spend money and save in retail. And that's just one example that I've seen work fantastically well elsewhere. So again, one man's view, something worth exploring. This next slide is partially about not just carrying the burden on your own. A lot of the time, particularly in smaller enterprises, you're the king of the castle. You're the person who is accountable for everything. In our business, I often talk to our members about them being concerned about levies. They're concerned about GST. They're concerned about wages. They pay property costs. They've got to manage stock. Everything falls on the individual. And because they're used to being in that position, when it comes to meeting your challenges in terms of things like managing cost, these guys are absolutely snowed with trying to come up with the answers themselves. Now, I'm saying it's humility, maybe it's accountability, but the simple reality is this: ask people, spread the burden, right? So ask your team, and it's a great mechanism because actually you can quite often assess how bought in people are, how creative they are, by saying to them, look, you tell me where we think we could save money. And some people will come up with great ideas and other people will never come up with anything. But it's a great mechanism for assessing who's where and why. Ask your suppliers. And don't ask your suppliers just because you might get something from them. But ask your suppliers because it positions you as someone who's being proactive and being optimistic and being flexible in challenging circumstances. So engage with them as well. I don't think in retail, a lot of the time we spend enough time with our competitors. And I'm not just talking about competitors in your sector. Everyone who's out there who's competing for a retail dollar is a competitor of yours in some way. Given that's the case, then actually you can speak to any other retailer and get their thoughts about what they're doing. And you're almost certainly better off not limiting it to your sector, because there will tend to be received wisdom within a sector that says, this is how you do this. But if you step out of your sector and have conversations with people that you might not normally have conversations with, you might just find different approaches for mitigating some of the costs you're seeing. The other piece is your advisors. Too much of the time I see it in our business over and over again. Our team are using their accountants for GST returns. Occasionally they'll use them for payroll. They use them in the technical sense. But actually, there's also an opportunity to say, you must see a lot of businesses. Tell me what these other businesses are doing to mitigate their costs during this period. And again, you get input in that way without having to come up with or generate the ideas yourself. Look, this is my second to last slide, and I'll get through this as quickly as possible. Be flexible about what you do with your space. I call this, would you come and live with me? There's going to be a lot of fat space in retail. One of the best ways of mitigating your exposure, especially if you find out that you're doing more online and less in store, is the reality is you might need less space. If you need less space, have a conversation with the landlord, but also be flexible in terms of odd alliances that might come together or unusual partnerships. think about who else could complement your offer in your space. And you can use that not only to mitigate your lease costs, but actually if you're making good use of space in your store, you could also pull back your investment in stock because there'll be less of the space in store that you need to populate in order for it to look like you're serious about being in business. So we've seen florists introduced to our business. We've got just about 90% of our stores in Paper Plus that will have either New Zealand Post, Kiwi Bank or Lotto. We want those services in our stores because they bring foot traffic, but also because they help us better utilize the space we've got. So just be open to unusual partnerships. It's my last slide. And it's just about culture. And I've used old boy George because I hadn't seen him for years, and he's English and always entertaining. But it's actually worth thinking about iconic changes, just stuff that tells people that it's different, but it's different without necessarily it being over the top or panicking. So it may be you're an organization that does treats. You might have done morning teas. One of the things we did when we decided that we were going to address costs is we used to have something similar to a catered lunch when we had a board. We went from catered lunches to Subway, from Subway to getting gear from the supermarket. Now, we never had too much in the way of complaints, but people began to realize that we weren't going to spend loads of money on extraneous activity. So it might be signs and posters, just giving people messages, simple things like turn the light off when you leave the room. It doesn't have to be big, but there'll be this growing feeling that things are changing. Again, you might want to revisit things like opening hours. Don't be driven by what's happened in the past. You might want to look at what you buy. Do you buy branded products at the moment? Maybe you buy private label product going forward. And once again, it's not about a drop in quality. It's just about managing the message around price. You know, cleaning materials could be the same. The other piece as well, though, particularly for small to medium-sized enterprises, is that a lot of the time, and quite rightly so, some of the activity of spending money is devolved to other people. And I'm kind of going, look, you might find in these tough circumstances where cash it as a premium and we're trying to mitigate costs, things change. So the conversations might be, you used to buy that and now I do. Or I'm not dismissing your thoughts in this. You give me a view, please suggest, but I'll make the final call. Or it may just be, look, you carry on doing what you used to do, but you used to be able to spend this much. Now you're going to be able to spend that much. Now, it's interesting how often those conversations seem to be really difficult for retailers in small organizations. But in these circumstances, even if it's a conversation you find it tough to have, now's the time, because essentially we're talking about new circumstances. And if there are new circumstances, we should also be talking about new frameworks. So you've got the green light, you've got the information. As I said, you just got to act. So this is the end of my piece, and I'm happy to take any questions, but hopefully I've showed you the money.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sam. Can I just request that you turn your screen share off?
Yeah.
And then we can, unless there's a slide you wish to share at the end.
No.
Nope, that's all. Okay, very good.
It. Bear with me 1 second.
Yep, no worries. I'll leave you to do that while I get you to contemplate the question I'm about to ask you. Coming back to your question or your comment about subscriptions. We've seen, or would you like me to turn it off for you?
Yeah, it would be good.
Yep, no problem.
Like I said, I'm a Teams man. I don't know what this game is. Oh, excellent. There I am. I'm back.
You are. You never went away. We saw you, but you were tiny. So your comment about subscriptions. We've seen the proposal for Costco to enter the market. with the site that they have planned, I believe out west in Auckland.
Yeah.
And what I've seen in the media is that that is still the intention, although I've not yet seen any site works going on or anything along those lines.
Yeah.
Costco obviously is well known for their subscription membership, and it's quite a substantial amount of money that their customers have to spend in order to purchase in their stores.
Yeah.
Is that a model, do you think, that other retailers can also explore? Is it something particular about Costco? And I'm not sure how much you know about the organization, but is it something particular about Costco, or is it something that customers might be willing to adopt once they see the benefits for them?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I think Jean should come in on this as well, because I actually learned most about Costco from Jean. But I do think it absolutely is a model that can be explored. I think it is a step on from some of the basic loyalty programs that are out there that says do X amount of coffees and you'll get this one free. There might be something to be said for actually giving them a lower price every day, as long as they commit an amount up front. And like I said, if people are prepared to commit that amount up front, then actually they're paying for the discount in advance. And if you've got flexibility with something like cash, then you save costs elsewhere, like the cost of a bank overdraft. And it gives you the ability as well to withstand unexpected impacts. So going through this period, cash is absolutely king. It always has been. I once did a very brief study of a set of companies called Tricentennials. They'd all existed for 300 years or more. There was only one thing all of those businesses had in common, and that is they had material cash reserves. So that when the unexpected happened, so that was world wars and depressions and all the rest of it, they had a mechanism for surviving. So for me, I think subscription is a model that can be explored by many, many people, and we don't want to overcomplicate it as well. You know, it's a Christmas club. Do you know what I mean? It's that simple, and it is something that I think more and more people will be open to, because it's being driven by the likes of Amazon and Costco. So John, I see you back on. John can tell you a bit more about their model, which is fascinating.
Andrew, yeah, thanks, Sam. I'll jump in there. I mean, I want to just pick up on something Sam said, because it's very, very true. And your point on Costco, Costco is a machine. But the reason they are so good at what they do is their model is ridiculously simple. It is ridiculously simple. They make a 14% gross margin. They run their business at around 13%. After membership fees, they'll net about 2.5 to 2.7% EBITDA. They do it every single year. And the reason they are so predictable and they can forecast the year in advance is because their model has benchmarks and parameters around how it works. No more than 3,750 to 4,000 SKUs. The same predictability goes around their DNA. They know how many customers they need. They know their customers come to their stores 4.5 times a year. And the average transaction value in a Costco store is somewhere around $375 per transaction. But they do it in such a way that they can predict what's going on. It's exactly the point Sam has made. They can predict what's going on because they manage the simple things in store really well. One SKU per pallet. And one interesting stat that I've always found fascinating about Costco is when they started their first business back in the US, they sold their iconic meal, which was the hot dog and the drink, and they have not changed the price for 37 years. It was $1.50 then. I think it's $1.50. It's still $1.50 now. They've never ever changed the price of their product in over 30 years. So it's the way that they keep saying to their customer, you know, it's how they show consistency about what they do, and it's just it's in that sense they have a lot of predictability, which means they can build a very simple model for them to follow. The more complex things become, the more moving parts they are, the harder it is to cope, and the more flexible it is to be. Theirs is a lot simpler.
Yeah, obviously Costco is quite a different model to what we see in this country with the product sizes, for example. Everything they sell is upscaled. 1 litre bottles of mayonnaise and so on being the minimum order quantity. But I'm wondering if the similar kind of model might apply in different ways for smaller retailers too. So take, for example, bookshops, which, you know, we've had subscription book services in the past where you get the bestseller of the month being sent to you if you sign up for their club. Yeah. Those kinds of things, which still operate at schools. Yeah. But I'm wondering if there's a co-payment option that could be something worth exploring. So you pay a subscription for the year and you get 50% off a range of books over that year, a specified, you know, reduced set. Yeah. Things along those lines. You get the money up front as a retailer, but the customer can really see the price benefit to them in the long run.
Yeah, look, it could be that, or it could be that you pay a given amount, and you need to model this carefully. But you pay a given amount, and once you've paid that given amount, you're guaranteed a discount on all of your purchases going forward. That's a slight build on that model. But if you modeled it carefully and you understood average transaction size and frequency of visit, it's easy to model what would work, and it's also reasonably easy to trial something like that as well. So yeah, look, those opportunities are there, but the reason why I am particularly attracted to subscription models is not just the fact that they are mechanisms for generating cash up front, and not just for the fact that you can triage your promotion or discount against what your customers are going to spend, but it's also the fact that if you spent the money with me, you're going to want to get your value. So even if you can see the same product elsewhere, you're going to be inclined to come back and spend with me anyway, because you already have, and you're just trying to get a return on that investment you've made. Yep. So I think it's something that is a pretty attractive model that will gain traction over time.
Awesome. Jean, in your comments, you made mention of private labels, and if I understood you correctly, you were suggesting that private labels haven't been selling as well in this current period. I'm assuming you don't mean in grocery, because what we're seeing in the reports out of Nielsen and IRI is that private label sales have gone up significantly, and partly that's because of a retreat towards lower cost items, of trying to save money wherever possible. Is that what you're seeing, or where do you see the role of private labels going in New Zealand?
So just on the latter part of your question, Andrew, there's no doubt I think private label will continue to get bigger and bigger penetration. And you're right. I mean, your first point on supermarkets is exactly right. Supermarket private labels have generally speaking, had a pretty good time of it in the last 8 weeks. But the private label performance I'm referring to is different between geographies and categories. So certain countries have not seen anywhere near what New Zealand has seen in terms of private label, and including in food. Simply because the brand equity isn't there in some of the private labels, or they're just not that particularly well known. And in other instances, it's delineated by category. So it all depends on the circumstances that the business and the industry and the geography and the brand equity. I mean, that's reasonably straightforward. But your second point around where's it going to go? There is, what COVID did for many trends is just accelerate them, not change them. So we were on a path to get bigger and bigger share of online, obviously, and what it's done is just accelerated that into trend. And now the brakes have come on it, but again, so we might actually go back to something which we may have predicted just 6 months ago. And I think the same is true of things like private label. It might just have given the opportunity for a retailer who has, currently exploring what their private label mix might look like, or redefining what their price architecture might be, or about to get into supply arrangements with suppliers who, for new private label, or expanding into different categories. It's a really interesting time to stop and check, and to Sam's point, just get some smart data on what the last 8 weeks have meant, because it would be a pity not to take advantage of any movement, left or right, up or down, for individual ranges, or perhaps categories where there has been not a great representation of private label. And obviously I'm talking about this from the retailer's perspective, because you're right, certainly in food, it's gone nuts.
Yeah. And I wonder if the
Andrew, on that,
go for it.
Sorry, just on that point, when we're in the UK, and Sainsbury's was one of the pioneers of private label, we always used to say poorer people need cheap prices, and more wealthier people have good prices. So, for a period, there was almost this thing that said, that people trading down because of private label. Actually, in these sorts of environments, people are less concerned about perception. They're much more concerned about cash. And to Jean's point, the quality of private label in New Zealand is quite good. So when you're trading down, you're saving money, but you're not necessarily going down in quality. And I think there will be huge opportunities for private label through this period and beyond.
And of course, they've been quite heavily pushed with the TV show that's on TV1. I think it is Eat Well for Less. It was a British program, now has its New Zealand counterpart, and the message every week is you should be buying private label. I'm conscious of the time. So
just one question here, Andrew. This is the question I see from Bray.
Yep. Go ahead.
Bray's just, brand loyalty went out the window over COVID as well. I think it's, Bray, I don't know for every industry, of course, but I do think what's really interesting is that I agree with you. I've seen that in a number of different things. And what it's meant is that, if you think about the repertoire of shopping items that a customer has when he or she or they or them go off to a store, it's we tend to be, in many respects, creatures of habit. And in many respects, what COVID has done is allowed people the opportunity for exploring different brands, products, pack sizes, opportunities. And so if I had the data for my own store, how much exploration has taken place, and certainly in business like yours, Bray, you could probably find that kind of information out quite easily. If I knew where that has gone, the question I'd be asking myself is, now that we're in level 2, has that trend come back to the norm, or has it stayed there? And I think you've got a window of opportunity, but it's got to be really fast to try and make those new categories, if it's in your interests, make it much more attractive for your customer. Because there's no doubt we've explored different things, whether that's trying to save money or just being, baking is a great example in my own home. We don't do a lot of baking, but my goodness, we've tried and done some interesting things around making our own pizzas and everything. And so there's a whole lot of new habits that might be worth trying to entrench from your perspective as the retailer.
Yeah, very good. So we probably have a couple more minutes if there are any further questions that you'd like to pose. Now's an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask that question of Jean or Sam, or both, if you wish.
I'll just make a quick point on brand loyalty. And we quite often talk about loyalty programs. I think if things have changed through COVID, and they would have in a lot of instances, because we forced everyone to shop online, even when they didn't want to in a lot of instances. If anything has changed through COVID, then the best way of getting them back is by enhancing your experience and dialing up those things that can't be replicated online. So for instance, in our stores, we've really emphasized service and curation. So recommendations to know the customer and to identify what's working in our store and what would be of interest to them. And we're using the experience side that you can't replicate online to encourage customers to come back in. Someone also talked, I think Jean mentioned earlier, about going local as well. And if you see any of our Paper Plus emails, every one of our emails now has an exhortation to shop local, buy local, go local. And we're just driving that local message because, again, I think we've seen a shift from online overseas retailers, some of it into bricks and mortar, some of it into domestic retailers. And I think there's a growing inclination to go, hold on a second. A lot of the problems of COVID came from elsewhere. Let's make sure that we're putting our dollars into the local economy, into local businesses. And we're trying to make sure that we give them good reasons to be able to do that by not letting them down in terms of their retail experience.
Fantastic. Haven't seen any further questions, so any last comments, Jean? You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. No, Andrew, all good. I think we've probably said enough for today.
Fantastic. Sam?
No, nothing from me. Just thanks everyone for coming along.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Andrew, for sorting it out.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And thank you both for your fantastic insights. And clearly very experienced, got lots of things to say. We could be here for the rest of the afternoon and not complete that conversation. I do want to bring your attention to next week's webinar, which is this screen behind me, webinar 6. We're carrying on this conversation, but with a particular focus on physical goods, how goods come into a business, how they get moved around, and how they get shipped out to the consumer, the last mile problem that Jean alluded to earlier. So we have 3 speakers next week. We have Andrew Buxton, formerly of the Warehouse Group and eStar. Now he's set up his own small health business. We have Mark Blackburn, also previously of the Warehouse Group, now with Goodman Fielder. And we have Jeff of Parcelport, a last mile aggregator. So 3 quite different perspectives, 3 very experienced people, and look forward to seeing them next week. Thank you very much, Jean and Sam, for your comments and for your time, and go well.
Cheers,
Thanks very much, Andrew. Cheers, Sam. Thanks, Andrew. Bye-bye, everyone.
See you later.